Jeanette.
This looks like it's going. Okay, I will bow out. I'll be here, but I'll let you all take care of it. So,
welcome everyone to the Terminal Aesthetics panel. I'm so excited to share this today, and I'll start by introducing everybody and introducing their papers, and then we'll have each paper and just a minute in between to absorb what they've said. And then after all three papers, we'll open the panel out to questions as usual. So we have Marlene Dirschauer. Marlene completed her PhD at Friedrich Schlegel Graduate School in Berlin and at the University of Cambridge. Her monograph, Modernist Waterscapes, Water, Imagination and Materiality in the Works of Virginia Woolf, is forthcoming with Palgrave Macmillan, and I have to say I'm so excited to read this. Since October 2021, Marlene has been a visiting professor at Humboldt-University of Berlin. In April 2022, she joined the Hamburg University to explore the transformations of meditation in post-Reformation England. Our next speaker will be Alexandra Huang-Kokina. She's a doctoral candidate at the University of Edinburgh, currently writing up her PhD in music and literature. She read a BA and a Masters of Science in English Literature, MSc, sorry, in English Literature at the University of Edinburgh, and was awarded an MA in piano performance at the Royal Conservatory of Scotland. Her research focuses on the interrelations between music and 20th century prose writing. Her literary analysis draws on the cultural history of Western classical music, historical musicology, performance studies, and the intellectual theories of performativity. When time permits, she's dedicated to solo piano performance and creative collaborations with practicing artists. Our last speaker will be Lee Okan. She's a PhD creative writing candidate. Oh dear, how am I going to say this, Lee? Aberystwyth?
Yeah, you got it.
Thank you. Aberystwyth University. For her dissertation, she wrote a novel, Talitha Cum, and evaluated the representation of suicide in fiction. She is the author of the novella The Lives of Atoms and is currently writing a book on the representation of sexual violence in graphic novels. She teaches at Lesley University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The names of the three papers we'll be listening to: Marlene Dirschauer's paper is Rethinking Death and Creativity in Woolf's Poetics of Water. Then we'll have Alexandra's paper, The Ethics of the Wagnerian Death in the Voyage Out. Then we'll have Lee Okan's paper, which is Mrs. Dalloway, The Ethics of Time and Suicide. So if I may ask, Marlene, could you please present your paper?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Angie, for this kind introduction. Can you hear me all right, and can you see my slides?
We can see them and we can hear you.
Okay, brilliant. Oh, sorry. First of all, I'm so happy to be part of this wonderful conference. And even though she's in another panel at the moment, I would really like to thank Amy for organizing this. To quote from To the Lighthouse, the whole of the effort of merging and flowing and creating rested on her. And from what I've gathered so far, she too has created something truly memorable. Today, I'm going to talk about Virginia Woolf's death, but only as a starting point to turn to the primary focus of my talk, Woolf's ecological ethics. The River Ouse and water more generally will be the link between them. When I was writing my PhD on Virginia Woolf and water, one of the most frequent questions I was asked by non-Woolfians was, oh, wasn't she the one who drowned herself? At least in popular culture, it still seems difficult somehow to separate the author from her works. Can you here see one example? Mm-hmm. And even though as literary scholars, we know better than this, the propensity is still there, even among critics, to link her suicide to her aesthetics. Vivian Forrester, for instance, reads the water that runs throughout Virginia's work as pointing the way to the River Ouse. David Bradshaw's paper on Virginia Woolf and the sea ends on the speculation that Woolf chose to drown herself rather than take her life in any other way, and he links this to her lifelong tendency to fly southwards in her mind. I'm probably preaching to the converted when I express my skepticism about attributing any kind of aesthetic purpose to Woolf's suicide. I can only echo Olivia Laing's hesitance to, quote, weigh every word with what would take place with what would take place years later in the Ouse. But there's more at stake here. To put it provocatively, I do not only see the need to liberate Woolf from psychobiographical interpretation, I also see the need to liberate the River Ouse from Woolfian metaphorics. In our Western literature and culture, there has always been a strong tendency to make nature and waterscapes in particular a reflective medium of human consciousness. As I show more extensively in my book, water to Woolf is of significant metaphorical potential. Yet at the same time, water is an element of, quote, liberating anti-symbolic quality. And I'm borrowing these words from Susan Sontag's essay, Against Interpretation. Throughout her oeuvre, Woolf stresses the value of seeing the thing in itself, that is, of seeing the thing before it is translated into the symbolic order. That's why water and nature more generally was so attractive to Woolf, because it is, of course, indifferent to the human symbolic order. It is Woolf's awareness of this liberating anti-symbolic quality of nature that makes her works truly visionary in terms of ecological ethics. She allowed the real and the metaphorical, nature and culture, the non-human and the human, to coexist in her works, and she refrained from collapsing these two levels of meaning into one. Yet we collapse these levels if we read the River Ouse as a kind of destiny that was aesthetically prepared for in and through Woolf's writing. Therefore, I'm using Woolf's suicide as a particularly salient example to argue that we sometimes attach meaning to things that actually resist our attempts at meaning making. Woolf's writing continuously draws our attention to the limits of human appropriations of nature. Recent eco-critical readings have persuasively shifted the focus away from human-centered subjectivity to the world around us, a world Woolf was drawn to as a relief from the symbolic patriarchal order. In my paper today, I will focus on how Woolf's water writing brings forward her ecological ethics. In the first part of my paper, I will show how Woolf uses water to challenge the dominance of the symbolic. In the second part, I will argue that even her most personal writing reveals her reverence for and humility toward a natural force that she knows can never fully be translated into fixed cultural signifiers. The River Ouse has become such a cultural signifier, which I would argue goes against the grain of Woolf's own perspective of nature. So now to the first part, the possibilities and limitations of metaphor. The Mark on the Wall offers a wonderful example of how Woolf time and again pictures the world of the human imagination as an underwater realm, detached from the mundane reality of everyday life. A world without professors or specialists or housekeepers with the profiles of policemen. A world which one could slice with one's thought as a fish slices the water with his fin, grazing the stems of the water lilies hanging suspended over nests of white sea eggs. How peaceful it is down here, rooted in the center of the world, and gazing up through the grey waters with their sudden gleams of light and their reflections. To Woolf, the depth of water were the appealing space of solitude, quietness, and undisturbed thought, a realm in which the mind was free to think and create. Now, this link between water and creativity was nothing new. In fact, water and creation have always been closely connected. We only need to look at various creation myths to see this. What is new about Woolf is that she actively challenges some of the symbolism that is inherent in human appropriations of water as a symbol of creation and fertility. The innovativeness of Woolf's stance becomes particularly tangible in Woolf's short story, A Simple Melody. The main character, George Carslake, while being at a party, looks at a painting of a landscape and imaginatively enters the natural scene represented in it. Carslake muses on the attraction water has to human beings as follows. Now, a curious thought struck him, that the waters possessed an attraction for the people on earth. They all wished to take to the water. But what was the water? Understanding, perhaps. Some went under and were satisfied. Others came gasping to the top. At first, Carslake applies the old analogy between depth and human understanding. The cultural construct in which going deeper implies getting closer to the truth. And Woolf uses this metaphor again and again. One goes down into the well, she notes, and nothing protects one from the assault of truth. And elsewhere she observes, I feel that if I sing further, I shall reach the truth. But then something radically new happens. He was relieved to find, so this is a simple melody again. He was relieved to find himself thinking of death as a plunge into a pond. For he was alarmed at his mind's instinct when unguarded to rise into clouds and heaven and rig up the old comfortable figure, the old flowing garments and mild eyes and cloud-like mantle. In the pond, on the other hand, were newts and fish and mud. The point about the pond was that one had to create it for oneself.
I think Marlene's computer is just frozen, so we'll wait a moment. Marlene, you're back.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, don't worry, these things happen. So we're up to the quote, the last line, the last two lines.
Yeah. And I need to share, of course I need to share. Yeah, Carslake criticizes a concept of language as already given. In other words, he attacks the predominance of the symbolic order. Figuring as a proxy for Woolf, he seeks to find a new language, one that has freed itself from the language of institutional authority, from the comforts of doctrines, and from the rigidity of common modes of representation. To craft one's own vision of death is both an emancipation from language and an emancipation through language. The freedom to think of death as a plunge into a pond. The freedom to put one's own idiosyncrasies against the symbolic order. No image could convey this better than the pond, a strikingly modest image that seems to challenge the culturally charged topoi of the deep sea or the flowing river that so prominently shaped the landscapes of the literary past, and Woolf's own works, of course. Not surprisingly, the pond recurs in Woolf's last posthumously published novel, Between the Acts. And here too does it comprise both levels of meaning, the metaphorical and the material, creativity and death, the real and the imaginative. The pond becomes a source of inspiration for the artist figure Miss Latrobe, who states that only the roots beneath water were of use to her, and who wanted, like that carp, darkness in the mud. But Woolf also counterbalances this metaphor with the pond's material realness. when the realm of the imagination gives way to a banal and mundane reality, and we learn that instead of Lady Ermyntrude drowning in the pond's heart of darkness, a sheep's thigh bone has been recovered from its water. To conclude this first part of my paper, I suggest that Woolf's challenge of the symbolic order is the precondition of a new attitude towards the physical world, because it asks us to look more attentively at what is actually there, what is materially present, what is in front of us. I would now like to flesh out Woolf's ecological ethics by turning to some autobiographical scenes that revolve around the indifference of water. Even in her most intimate encounters with nature, Woolf acknowledges nature's non-human and impersonal otherness. Again and again, her turn to nature afforded her an escape from an anthropocentric and egocentric perspective. Indeed, Woolf was wary of a self that, quote, never embraces or creates what is outside itself and beyond. She championed the thing that exists when we aren't there. She was fascinated with the question of how to describe the world seen without a self, and considered the impersonal world as a proof of some existence other than ours. In my book, I have linked Woolf's modernist affinity for impersonality to her appraisal of a nature indifferent to humanist pretensions, a nature careless of the whims of the self. The appeal of such an indifferent nature underlies her writing from beginning to end. In an early letter to Lytton Strachey from 1908, she relates her feelings when swimming far out from the shore. I had begun to doubt my own identity and imagined I was part of a seagull and dreamt at night of deep pools of blue water full of eels. A similar idea of a sea change spurred the following letter to Violet Dickinson. Yesterday, I hired a gentleman's or lady's, it was bisexual, bathing dress and swam far out until the seagulls played over my head, mistaking me for a drifting sea anemone. These scenes bespeak Woolf's lifelong aesthetic pleasure of eliminating the human features, of leaving behind her identity in a conflation with the natural world, in which her own self easily disappears, in which the I, as the Romantic poet John Keats put it, is in very little time annihilated. In November 1940, a few months before her death, Woolf describes how the marshes around the Ouse were flooded due to a bomb blocking its flow. In her diary, Woolf imaginatively charts a world in which she is still present, but indistinguishable from a non-human nature, indifferent to her presence. Woolf writes, "Yesterday, the river burst its banks. The marsh is now a sea with gulls on it. Leonard recovered and I walked down to the hangar. Water broken, wide, roaring, pouring down through the gap by the pillbox. Today, the rain is tremendous and gale, as if dear old nature were kicking up her heels. Down to the hangar again, flood deeper and fuller. Bridge cut off. Water made road impassable by the farm. So all my marsh walks are gone until another break in the bank. It comes over in a cascade. The sea is unfathomable." Woolf was worried at first that her routine of daily walks would be put in jeopardy. Soon, however, she took to this artificial seascape with increasing delight, and 10 days later wrote to her friend Eva Smith, "Then, to my infinite delight, they bombed our river. Cascades of water rode over the marsh. All the gulls came and rode the waves at the end of the field. It was and still is an island sea of such indescribable beauty, almost always changing day and night, sun and rain, that I can't take my eyes off it. Oh dear, how I love this savage medieval water moved, all floating tree trunks and flocks of birds and a man in an old punt, and myself so eliminated of human feature that you might take me for a stake walking." Waterscapes proved particularly suited to initiate Woolf's fantasies of metamorphosis. The pleasure she takes in imagining herself as part of this island sea and savage medieval water, and the delight she felt in changing her human features for stake walking, is a particularly vivid example of the appeal that to Woolf lay in the idea of escaping the human frame. Of course, in the 21st century, we have deprived ourselves of the luxury of innocently appreciating the beauty of a nature manipulated by human violence. Woolf still had that luxury. Even in the midst of war, the timeless waters flooding the marshes evoke a sense of the indescribable beauty of a nature that exists outside of human parameters. While these scenes capture moments of Woolf's mergence with the natural world, they do not anticipate her own death. Rather, I would argue, they anticipate Roland Barthes' idea of the death of the author. Literature is that neuter, that composite, that oblique into which every subject escapes. The author enters his own death. I propose to complement Barthes' anthropocentric perspective with an ecocentric one. Both literature and nature allowed Woolf to see things in perspective, to see the bigger picture. As A Room of One's Own demonstrates, Woolf believed in a genealogy of literature that precedes and exceeds the individual author. Likewise, she was acutely aware of an indifferent nature that precedes and exceeds the individual human subject. Literature and nature were the most important sources of Woolf's striving for impersonality. In my view, we risk neglecting this wisdom of hers if we, from the usual anthropocentric viewpoint, linger only on that which is personal and on that which is symbolic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, we'll just take a minute now to absorb this wonderful paper, and then we'll move on. If anyone's starting to formulate questions, feel free to start to put them in the chat, and we'll save them for the discussion later. Okay, our next paper is from Alexandra Huang-Kokina, and the title of this paper is The Ethics of Wagnerian Death in the Voyage Out.
Thanks so much for having me at the conference. And actually, the initial title was The Ethics of Wagnerian Death in the Voyage Out and Jacob's Room, but just that realizing that I only have 20 minutes time, so I need to cut a bit out of my paper. So today we'll just probably listen to a fragment of my original paper, and it is still very much work in progress. So any feedbacks and comments will be really appreciated. First of all, let me share my screen. Can we all see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So my paper reconceptualizes the ethics of death in Virginia Woolf's The Voyage Out, her first novel. In the existing scholarship on Woolf's fiction writing, her death narrative is commonly designated as the mournful obituary or the elegiac valedictory for the protagonist in question. Via conducting a miniature case study of Virginia Woolf's first novel, my paper reconfigures the Woolfian concept of death as a Wagnerian notion of decadence, and therefore pointing to a shift of ethical connotations in Woolf's studies. I will firstly examine how Woolf's fiction writing both builds on and interrogates the decadent ideas of Wagnerism, and then explore the extent to which novelistic details manifest the Wagnerian vision of life denial, in order to transfigure the implications of death into aesthetic self-transcendence. My paper argues that the death narrative in the novel revitalizes two common operatic motives, disease and marriage, to evoke ideas of decadence in a new Wagnerian tradition, and therefore deviating from Virginia Woolf's decadent predecessors that deploy Wagnerism as the signification for hypersensuality. The death of the musical protagonist, Rachel Vendress, is preceded by her mad state, as I will argue, which invalidates her ordinary selfhood as a middle-class woman, whilst reviving her decadent artistic subjectivity to reformulate her death scene into a celebratory cadence of marriage in death. In the context of the decadent movement of the 19th century, death can be conceived of differently as the aesthetic denial of the Philistine bourgeois lifestyle. In the Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche deduces from Socrates' final words to construe the philosopher's declining and weary instinct for the lateness of his life as a decadent attitude, namely his exhaustion with or resistance to life itself. Noting that decadence belongs to all epochs of mankind, Nietzsche asserts that decadence itself is nothing to fight against. Rather, it is the creeping contagion of the healthy parts of the organism that should be fought with all one's might. In the wake of the pervading presence of decadence in the modern age, Nietzsche deploys a range of tools to confront its dominance, most famously through the concept of Wagnerian total art to engage a comprehensive aesthetic context. In the case of Wagner, 1888, Nietzsche views that Wagner's aesthetics as the epitome of contemporary decadence. According to Golub Alexander, Nietzsche's take on Wagnerian decadence in the treatise can be examined as a multifaceted phenomenon. Firstly, Nietzsche's statement that Wagner is a neurosis whose art is sick suggests a physio and psychological diagnosis of Wagner's music as spreading decadence via neurotic convulsions and theatrical excess. Secondly, Wagner's opera theatre manifests the stylistic hallmark of decadence to be emulated in other artistic contexts, including poetry and literature. The sort of calculated synthetic artifact of Wagner's artwork embodies a tendency wherein the vibration and the exuberance of life are pushed back into the smallest structures, and all the rest are just impoverished of life. This suggests a decadent temptation that calls for over-subtilizing artistic refinement. And moreover, Wagner also relies on what Nietzsche terms as his corrupted taste of decadence to enforce a law of a higher taste, which poses a political threat to tyrannize our ordinary perception of empirical phenomena under his decadent rubric. Overall, Nietzsche's conception of Wagnerian decadence provides a fertile loam for reconfiguring death. Through the lens of Wagnerian decadent aesthetics, death can be reconceptualized as the negation of everyday life that is at odds with over-luxurious artificiality, moral perversity, and visceral sensuousness. For decadent writers at the turn of the 20th century, music is the most formative of all art and is therefore efficacious in realizing the potential of Wagnerian decadence in the literary setting. The sort of emotive and central power of Wagner's music prompts writers such as Aubrey Beardsley, Arthur Symons, and Oscar Wilde to valorize it in mannered and hyperbolic terms. Transgressing middle-class sexual decorum, Wagner's music drama critiques the insipid materialism of the new industrial bourgeoisie, whilst enacting an intensely physical possibility of aesthetic refinement in its experimentation with a diseased art form. Crucially, Wagnerian decadence stimulates the vitality of English cultural life at the intersection between music and literature. The range of literary commentary on Wagner's music, which thematizes his renowned operas, or contextualizes actual performances, or pastiche the affectation of the audience response in fiction, this all indicates the extent to which Wagnerism seeps through the decadent literature of the time. However, this pervasive valorization of Wagnerian decadence met with renewed skepticism at the beginning of the 20th century. In her essay, Within a Space of Tears, Emma Sutton knows that proto-modernist writers try to steer clear of the 90-ish Wagnerian fad, strategically depriving their writing of the ecstatic mannerism exemplary of the fin de siècle musical commentary. For instance, Virginia Woolf's prose writing refashions the decadent cliché of Wagnerism of the 1980s into carnivalesque pathos of change and renewal. Her first novel, The Voyage Out, is wary of the alarmingly mannered and dated musical enthusiasm derived from the 19th century grand opera. The less than mannered pianistic accounts are rather imbued with the piano-playing protagonist, feminist experimentation on, and also her contemplation of a new aesthetic modernity. Likewise, in Virginia Woolf's modernist novel, Jacob's Rome, transduces emotive hypertension and the live performance of Wagner into animation or caustic social observations. Virginia Woolf's deviation from the decadent's first formulation of Wagner's music enables her prose to shed new light on literary Wagnerism. It retains the sort of decadent appeal to life denial or transcendental death, whilst rejecting access to this ideal via morbid neuroerotic mannerism. Virginia Woolf's The Voyage Out interrogates the Wagnerian concept of decadence in and through the semantic evocations of illness, death, and musical performance. In the novelistic context of the novel of The Voyage Out, the piano-playing protagonist Rachel Vinders perishes of an exotic disease on her grand expedition. In the death narrative of the novels and the penultimate chapter, Rachel's melody culminates in her final moments of near-death delirium, which invites an interpretation of her death as the performative enactment of decadent Wagnerism. Following Rachel's engagement, the mystical disease punctures the anticipatory patterns and meaning of ordinary marital life. Shortly after her indulgence in the independence and the certainty of her marital prospect, the sudden outburst of her excruciating headaches relinquished the happiness of her self-reflection and therefore put a gulf between her feverish world and the ordinary world. At certain stages of her illness, her coherent and lucid speech is deprived. She begins to gabble unintelligibly and once turns to her fiancé Terence and asks him anxiously some questions about a man with mules, which he could not even understand. For her tormented listener, Terence hears what she was saying, but it conveys no meaning to his mind, and therefore convinces himself that it is not possible that this has happened to him ever. Meanwhile, Rachel's maddening delirium subordinates her fiancé to one long-drawn sensation of sordid misery, disrupting expectant happiness as derived from their previous marital commitments. Rachel's lapse into madness is compounded by the fact that the disease reformulates her ordinary selfhood in the course of her illness. As Rachel persists in the miniature world of the bedchamber and isolated alone with her body in the period of convalescence, the aggravating symptoms radically reconstitute her cognitive, perceptual, and existential modes of being. Her delusional sense of temporality disrupts the linearity of her memory. Initially, she woke up to find herself in the midst of one of those interminable nights which do not end at 12, but go on into the double figures, 13, 14, and so on, until they reach the 20s, and then the 30s, and then 40s. Later on, Rachel interprets the sight of Terence, her fiancé, as very stress-inducing, since she could not even fulfill his wish to join mind to body in the desire to remember anything. As she turns increasingly oblivious of the world outside, her perception of reality is reduced to disorderly symbols, and she registers the keen necessity to attend to the hot and red quick sights which passed incessantly before her eyes in order to grasp their meaning. Notably, her strange experience of sights is reminiscent of her prior piano-playing scenes, where the performance process is presented as her laborious physical engagement, with tangible symbols. For instance, her rendition of Bach's Fugue is described as the emergence of unidentified shapes and architectural symbols, whilst her playing of Beethoven's very late piano sonata is depicted as her climbing up a very steep spiral of a ruined staircase. The parallel symbolic illusions in her music making and in her illness can be perceived as her perverse preoccupation with sensual elements beyond the superficiality of this world. The eccentric symbolism induced by Rachel's disease at once invalidates her emerging identity as a bourgeois domestic bride-to-be, whilst reclaiming her former asset, musical selfhood, in detachment from ordinary reality. The theme of illness naturally links to climactic death narrative of the novel, which is inflected by the terminal ascetics of Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. Interestingly, at the beginning of the voyage, Rachel possesses a printed copy of Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. Despite her very long hours of piano practice, the audience, however, never had the chance to hear her live performance of that piece. Paradoxically, the implicit influence of Wagnerianism is externalized upon her sudden demise. In Wagner's opera, the poignancy of death can be transfigured into the positive idea, the German term "Come sweet death," which originated in the Christian myth and is thereafter recast as a patriotic ideal to render death as a delightful course. In Tristan, the motive of death is especially intertwined with the love plot to configure the vision of Levi-Strauss, the perpetual and undivided immersion of the two lovers' subjectivities in the nightly realm of death. In a similar vein, in The Voyage Out, Rachel's death scene is set in a quasi-Wagnerian theatre where the light is dim, in order to transpose the Tristan motive of Levi-Strauss in real-life context. The merged individuality of Rachel and her fiancé is presented as seemingly sinking together, and this sense of togetherness assuages Terence's former experience of acute agony and also restores his traumatic experience back to normality, and also transforms his sentiment of loss into reassuring pathos of renewal and rebirth. Rachel's imminent death permits her metaphysical undivided union that had been impossible when they lived, to the extent that the revelation dawns on Terence that so much better this was death. Death was perfect happiness. Meanwhile, the narrative complements the elated ambience that their complete union and happiness fill the room with rings eddying more and more widely, and that he has had no wish in the world left unfulfilled. Terence's embracing of Rachel's physical death resounds with the final longing motif in Tristan, and epitomizes the Woolfian ethics of death in Wagner's operatic reverie. It can be adduced from the disease narrative of the Voyage Out that the overlapping themes of Rachel's music-making, her illness, and her death can all be conceived of as her approximation to a mad state that is quintessential of female characters in opera. In his monograph, A Pitch of Philosophy, the American philosopher Stanley Cavell designates the mad state as a state of vocal inexpressivity of married womanly characters in the fictional framework of the opera. Madness is manifested via the transmission of their voice in ecstasy or hysteria, symptomatic of the paralysis of female vocality to express intelligible verbal meaning. Deviating from the patriarchal law of language, the mad state signals operatic women's departure from ordinary reality as mediated via words. It also significantly signals their denial of diurnal devotion to quotidian marital life, wherein the maternal voice of the women is always obedient to the dominant paternal voice. Existentially, the manifestation of madness mirrors the character's liminal state between life and death, since this state usually occurs on the brink of the female character's terminal death. The mad state therefore demolishes the present middle-class constructions of mundane and earthly marriage, liberating the marital women from the domestic stricture. In Virginia Woolf's novel, Rachel's loss of ordinary speech in her final moments of frenetic delirium evades the syntactic and semantic structure of words, and encroaches upon the mystic symbolism of Wagner's music. Most importantly, her euphoria revives her solipsistic, decadent selfhood that is isolated from the real world and formerly perceived by her social companions as unsuited for marriage. The outbreak of her disease can therefore be viewed as her subconscious resistance to, or her banishment from, the ordinary marital scheme, which her writer fiancé has nearly imposed on her by words in their instantaneous engagement. Finally, I would like to provide a possible interpretive model for that theme of the voyage out through an alternative lens of Wagnerism. In the final scene of Wagner's Ring Cycle, Stanley Cavell, the American philosopher, interprets the character Brunhilda's immolation, namely her self-sacrifice by burning in Götterdämmerung, as her undoing of all the cardinal virtue of an ordinary marriage. Her transgressive acts, such as removing her husband Siegfried's ring and throwing the ring into the Origin in Rhine River, and trading the ring back for the horse that she has given to Siegfried, and also riding the horse into the flames of the funeral pyre, consummate their relationship in what Cavell terms a black or red wedding ceremony, one wedding ceremony that is to end all other weddings in the world. In doing so, Brunhilda claims marriage without the ring and without foregoing freedom, which will undo the present constructions of the world. I propose that the voyage out's death scene can also be analyzed as comparable to Brunhilda's final scene of immolation. In Virginia Woolf's novel, the couple's final interactions upon Rachel's imminent death can be construed not merely as the concluding moment of her individual life, but also as the transcendental wedding in death, in place of a run-of-the-mill nuptial ceremony. Before her death, Rachel's sudden awakening from her deep reveries empowers a moment of illusions, and therefore enabling her marital union with Terence without being physically condemned to the domestic hearths of middle-class marriage. In conclusion, through a self-asserted form of death, Rachel emancipates herself from the marital order of the modern middle-class life and redeems her perpetual freedom from post-Victorian English society. Terence's final utterance that no two people have ever been so happy as we have been, no one has ever loved as we have loved, can be analyzed as his unreciprocated wedding vow that confirms the explosive intrusion of certainty and peace as brought forth by Rachel's death. Unlike Wagner's opera that animates fiery images to immolate worldly substances of marriage, the sort of maritime symbols of Virginia Woolf's Voyage Out, such as the cargo boat, the undulating waves, and the sea voyage, drift away from, as well as unsettle, the stability of Rachel's Anglo-centric life in the capital of England. The unexplored mysticism of the oceanic waves also built towards the death narrative throughout her expedition, which aqueously dissolves the tension between two oppositional worlds, reconciling her art with life, disease with health, madness with reason, and death with rebirth. And that's all for today's paper. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. That was absolutely fascinating. We will just take a couple of minutes to absorb your ideas, and then we'll move on to the next paper. Okay. Now we have Lee Okan's Mrs. Dalloway, The Ethics of Time and Suicide. Thank you, Lee.
Before I begin, I just want to thank Amy for organizing the conference and Angela for moderating today's panel. I also want to thank my co-presenters, Marlene and Alexandra. I'm really looking for the conversations that we're going to be having in just a moment after I present. And I also just think it's so wonderful to be part of the Virginia Woolf Society, where we can come together and talk about all things Virginia Woolf. So let me just get my slides up here. Are you able to see? Was that a yes? Okay, great, thank you. So I am presenting on Mrs. Dalloway, The Ethics of Time and Suicide. I first want to set a context from where this research is coming from, and also give a more philosophical context for lenses that I'm using to look at this topic. And then I'll tie that in more specifically with Mrs. Dalloway, and that will bring us to the conclusion. Now, I do know that, Angela, you did introduce me earlier, but I would like to introduce myself again. So my name's Lee Okan. I'm a PhD candidate at Aberystwyth University in Wales. And while I am currently at the moment in Turkey, I am actually based in Boston, where I teach literature and creative writing at Lesley University. I am a scholar, but I'm also a writer too. And my novella, The Lies of Atoms, was published by Nix's Made in 2018. It's a story that follows sort of lives becoming and told through sort of a quantum physics perspective. Now, to give some context about the research that I'm presenting today, this research is stemming from my dissertation, the full title of which is A Life is Everywhere, Suicide, Ominence, and Representation in Narrative, a critical commentary for Talitha Kum. This is still a work that's in progress, so I do appreciate feedback and conversations at the end of this presentation. Talitha Kum is a novel that I wrote in tandem with this research as a creative writing PhD candidate. And the novel and the research both inspect how suicide is represented in fiction, in which I would like to break free from the cliches that often surround suicide. And I think Virginia Woolf encouraged us to do this. I think Mrs. Dalloway specifically asked us to think differently about suicide. Now, I am in a room of Virginia Woolf scholars who know so much about her life and work. I do want to note that this research does not comment specifically on Woolf's suicide, nor her earlier suicide attempts. While I do think that the experience did impact the way that Woolf thought and wrote, I'm not going to delve specifically in her life experiences because I think that'll eclipse what I'm trying to focus on in terms of narrative. More also, this research also takes a more philosophical lens with the way of looking about suicide, but I do want to acknowledge that maybe there are some of us here today who have been impacted by suicide or directly or indirectly, and I have tried to be sensitive to that. That said, how do we talk about suicide? I think there are a few words out there that shut down conversations faster than a word like suicide. When I do tell people that I study the representation of suicide in fiction, that I wrote a novel about suicide, no one really wants to talk about it, and I understand because it's such a heavy topic. Suicide carries so much moral, ethical, cultural, social, religious, political baggage. So how do we even begin to unpack it? And I think part of the problem with suicide is its silence, the silence that enshrouds survivors of suicide attempts and silence that enshrouds those who have known someone who has made a successful suicide attempt. So how do we begin talking about it? One way that I want to approach suicide is thinking about the temporality of suicide, time and suicide. As Sing Hammer, the writer of the memoir By Her Own Hand, Memoirs of a Suicide's Daughter, she writes, suicide stops time. Before it happens, it's unimaginable. When it does happen, it feels unreal, out of time. And it's that out of time aspect that I'm particularly interested in, and what I call, with respects to what happens to Septimus and Clarissa and Mrs. Dalloway, sort of this narrative bracketing where these characters sort of step out of time. But before we specifically dive into Woolf's approaches to temporality of suicide, I do want to frame these considerations through three philosophers, Émile Cioran, Henry Bergson, and Gilles Deleuze. Now, I'm only going to highlight a few main ideas from each of these philosophers as it relates to this discussion because of the time that I have in this presentation today. So starting with Émile Cioran, he's a Romanian philosopher and categorized as one of the greatest existentialists. And he brings us this idea about suicide. It's not worth the bother of killing yourself, since you always kill yourself too late. You always kill yourself too late. Now, for Cioran, he did not believe that suicide was the answer, but I do think Cioran brings up some interesting considerations for suicide. One thing that I think is important, that he did consider suicide as an aspect of life and existence. One important idea that he has is that suicide is an option. He thought that we also miss out a lot by categorizing suicide as this very forbidden topic that we aren't supposed to talk about. And I think that's also something very important, because you lose out a lot by not actually talking about this topic. Cioran also believed that suicide was ultimately a temporal problem, an error of understanding about life. You always commit suicide too late. In other words, in Cioran's view, you've already experienced the inherent pain of existence, and you have no idea what the future holds. So in Cioran's view, to end your life, to solve that problem that has already kind of come and gone, doesn't actually solve the problem. But I think a more interesting argument that Cioran is making here is that an individual who considers suicide as an option to a problem is someone who may not have examined the nature of existence at a deep enough level yet, or may have otherwise suspended in their understanding of reality. And that part specifically in respects to what I'm looking at in Mrs. Dalloway, sort of this stepping out of time, not being connected to reality. So when we think about Septimus Smith in Mrs. Dalloway, we certainly see a case for the latter. As we know, Septimus is a shell-shocked soldier. He's returning from World War I. He does not actually want to die, and Woolf makes this very clear in Mrs. Dalloway. But why should he kill himself for their sakes? Speaking of Dr. Holmes and Dr. Bradshaw, food was pleasant, the sun was hot. He did not want to die. Life was good. But as we know, as the readers experiencing how Septimus experiences the world, we feel that Septimus has lost touch with reality. He has kind of stepped out of time, in other words. And Woolf also makes us feel sort of that Septimus does also kind of kill himself too late. We feel that tension when Dr. Holmes is arriving, right? Dr. Holmes is too late, and Septimus throws himself out the window. Septimus ultimately did not want to die, and Woolf makes that very clear to us in the narrative. For Cioran, suicide was a temporal problem. Woolf approaches this problem of temporality and suicide from a similar perspective. For those of you who are familiar with Ruth Gruber, an early scholar of Woolf's work, she writes that Woolf writing is not the immediate problem of to be or not to be, but is instead concerned with the being and the enigma of how long to be. So suicide becomes this option in Woolf's writing. Suicide also becomes, as we know, this defiance, this communication, as Woolf writes in Mrs. Dalloway. Woolf also doesn't see suicide as tragedy, and I think that's important to consider. Tragedy is this very loaded word. Instead, as narrated from Septimus's point of view, Woolf sees it this way: suicide was, for Dr. Holmes or Dr. Bradshaw, this idea of tragedy. Our Septimus, however, has lost touch with reality, has kind of stepped out of time with reality, and his experience of life throughout the narrative is more kind of like one of flow and not of rigidity or mechanistic time that we see through Dr. Holmes or Dr. Bradshaw. But the thing with Septimus is that he goes too far and he loses touch with reality. And I think one way to sort of experience Septimus's experience of time is to think of it as sort of flow or duration, which is akin to the philosophies of Henry Bergson, who can better help us understand. So I'm not going to go too deep into Bergson for this presentation today, but I just want to mention a few things about him. Bergson, as maybe some of you are familiar, philosopher of the 20th century, very natural cultural pairing with Woolf. And I won't go into if Bergson influenced Woolf or whether she read his work, but nonetheless, as Gruber writes in her dissertation, actually, she calls that both Woolf and Bergson are interested in the irrational dynamic reality in life. So for Bergson, there's two kinds of time. There's this rigid clock time and that divides and fragments our reality. And there's another kind of time, which is a more subjective experience, a more kind of duration. And I link duration much with a sort of inner stream of consciousness that Woolf uses in a lot of her writings, the sort of tunneling process to develop her characters, where characters kind of manifest past, present, and future as this kind of experience of becoming, which has a lot of affinity with many of Bergsonian ideas. Of all the characters in Mrs. Dalloway, Septimus is the one who steps out of time and steps so much out of time that he loses that contact with reality. He's concerned with being, concerned with experience. And I think he shares that a lot with Clarissa, who also does step out of time in her own way, but she never goes as far as Septimus. And it's actually something that she admires about him, which I'll go into later. But of the other characters that are in this novel, Doris Kilman, Dr. Holmes, Dr. Bradshaw, Whitbread, these are characters who are concerned with divisions and distractions and rigid time. So for instance, this quote really highlights the way that Dr. Bradshaw kind of thinks. To his patients, he gave 3/4 of an hour, and if his exacting science was has to do with what, after all, we know nothing about, a doctor loses his sense of proportion. As a doctor, he fails. Health we must have, and health is proportion. But as I've been saying, Septimus stands outside of this time. He inhabits what I call kind of a narrative bracketing, stepping outside of the time of the narrative even. And we have very often throughout the novel, as we know, sort of this repetition of time, Big Ben chiming, Rezia asking for the time, which every now and then brings Septimus back into this world, but eventually Septimus loses that touch with reality. So this stepping out of time in Woolf's exploration of both mechanical time through characters like Bradshaw and Holmes, as well as duration, sets up what I think is Woolf's exploration in suicide. So another philosopher that I want to use as a lens here is Deleuze, a French philosopher writing in the latter part of the 20th century. Deleuze is helpful to look at in this context of temporality and suicide, especially since Deleuze was both an admirer of Woolf and Bergson and wrote about them many times throughout his career. In the last year of his life, Deleuze committed suicide, and he wrote a short essay called Eminence, a Life, wherein he inspects the meaning of eminence. I won't go too much into this concept because it's quite a heavy philosophical term, but what I take away from it in context of my research is that eminence puts life and death on the same plane. Death is not in opposition to life, but death is enfolded into life. What this term can help us think about with regards to the ethics of suicide and the way that Woolf portrays in Mrs. Dalloway is that Woolf wants us to approach suicide from a non-judgmental perspective. Suicide is such a loaded term, as I've already noted. It carries so much baggage, and we sentence it to silence. And I think Woolf actually does want us to approach it and talk about it. But think, for example, when in Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa does learn that a young man, Septimus, has killed himself. There's a moment where she steps away from the party and that kind of narrative bracketing that I mentioned before, and she goes up to the room by herself. she intuits that Septimus has killed himself by jumping out the window. She has been told that Septimus has killed himself, but she doesn't know that he did it by jumping out the window. And actually, one of the first responses that she has when she hears that this young man has killed himself is she experiences it herself. She has this sort of empathetic reaction. But actually her first reaction before she has that empathetic experience is that she's mortified, right? She's like, this is my party. And it's kind of a selfish reaction. She's like, my party is ruined. It's not a reaction when we think about suicide, right? When we think about suicide and tragedy, it's not a reaction of sadness, it's not of shock. It's not, thinking of this young man's death as a tragedy. She actually thinks about, this is my party and it's now been ruined. But then she does have that empathetic experience, as I talked about. She said, or in the narrative, it says, she felt somehow very like him, the young man who had killed himself. And then she thinks, which is very strange, right? She thinks she felt glad that he had done it, thrown it away. She thinks Septimus plunged holding his treasure. Later in the narrative, we also have that his death made her feel life. He made her feel the beauty, made her feel the sun. So Septimus' suicide actually makes Clarissa feel joy. It makes her feel life. It's this idea of death being enfolded into life and life being enfolded into death. And this sort of, and that empathetic experience that Clarissa has, where she feels like she's gone through the same experience as Septimus, is kind of sharing the impersonal that can only exist on a plane of immanence where life and death affirm each other rather than standing in opposition with one another. And her reaction, this gladness that he killed himself, it's a really unusual reaction. It's really outside this idea of the cliche. The whole scene happens in a moment outside of time of the novel too, right? Clarissa's up in the room, she's kind of standing outside of time. And it's only when the bells start to chime, as we remember, that she's brought back into reality, right? She must assemble. Reality pushes itself in. So, while Septimus has gone out of bounds with reality, out of touch with time, Clarissa can do that, but she doesn't ever go as far as Septimus. But Septimus's death makes her feel that life again. So when we talk about suicide, we often think about the sadness of it, the tragedy of it. We might even condemn it. But Woolf actually asks us to step away from the cliche and to think about how suicide is represented. And, the question that I think she's asking us to think about suicide is, how do we approach it? So I really do want to open up ways to think about suicide differently and to move beyond the cliche of representation. And I think Woolf, and especially Mrs. Dalloway, can help open up these conversations about the ethics of suicide. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And let's just take 2 minutes now to formulate questions, and then we'll begin the discussion. Okay, fantastic. Thank you everybody for participating, and thank you so much to our three panelists who gave fantastic papers today. I wondered if anyone wanted to put their hand up and start the discussion that way.
Okay.
Jane, wonderful.
Okay, I'll start the bell rolling. I put a couple of comments in the chat and I realised both of them pertain to the waves, which I guess would apply across all three papers. So my first question, when Marlene was talking, wonderful paper about water in Woolf, and if you knew about the original draft of the waves, when the characters sort of arrive on the breakers, they're sort of born, the mothers are kind of in the sea and the children are sort of born on the breakers onto the sand. And then I was thinking with Alexandra's paper about Wagnerian motives in other novels, and of course the waves and Parsifal and that. And I guess also there is a suicide in, Rhoda commits suicide in the waves. So yeah, to any of the panelists, really, if anybody has thought about the waves and whether you wanted to bring that into the discussion.
Fantastic. Shall we start with you, Marlene?
Yes, thank you, Jane. I'm aware of the scene, and I actually dedicate a whole chapter to the relation between water and bodies, because I think that this is another example of a cultural construct that Woolf is deconstructing. Because we do have the analogy, and I'm not the first to point this out, in our cultural history of women and nature, and the kind of female fluidity as a symbol of sexuality. And I believe that Woolf is aware of this, and that there's a development in her oeuvre. So I'm in this chapter, I'm looking at actually the voyage out to the lighthouse, and the waves with to the lighthouse as and the artist figure Lily as the intermediary figure who actually allows for a new way of looking at women and fluidity, because she uses water as the source of another kind of productivity. And I know that we talked about the scene with the mothers yesterday. And if you want my interpretation, I think there's a reason Woolf decided to cut this original image, because I think she was critical of the kind of this maternal model. And she replaced this with, again, insensitive nature, the voice of the sea. So the waves really become the kind of textual matrix of the characters, and this allows Woolf to write bodies in a completely new way, because they are part of the fluid ontology that is the waves. So there are of course there are characters like Ginny, who feel empowered by their own fluidity, by their own sexuality, but it's no longer attached to the kind of phallocentric idea that connects women and water. And actually in modernism, this is quite common. You find that in Joyce, you find that in Pound. So this analogy, and it's often something that the male artist appropriates. So the idea of the male brain as the kind of womb that is being. So yeah, my argument in this chapter is that there's a development, and that's also one of the reasons why Rachel has to die, because there's not yet a space or room for her to create outside this kind of maternal model. Yeah.
That's such an interesting answer. So you're saying she decouples the female body from water and then gives this idea of waves and regeneration in a more impersonal, natural way to all the characters. That's such an interesting idea,
yeah.
Marlene.
And actually, this is already envisioned, I think, in the Voyage Out, because at some point Rachel says that she wanted more things. She wanted the sea and the sky. So she doesn't only want Terence. She craves this kind of insensitive nature that is so liberating to Woolf. But Rachel still is still seen as part of in analogy to the waterscapes in the text. So there's this wonderful their first meeting where Terence watches her, and she's wearing a dress of deep blue color, and to her the water seems unbroken, as if, so there's this whole analogy between, you know, virginity and this idea of the unbroken blue water that Woolf is using here, and with Lily we really have the liberation from this model, and then yeah.
Thank you. So it's invoked and then deconstructed. Let me just return to the chat because we've got a few great questions in here. Yes, so Jane, we'll return to your question for Alexandra. You were asking if she's thought about the Wagnerian motives in other Woolf novels like The Waves. Alexandra, would you like to take this?
Yes, thanks so much for your question. And actually, I read The Waves many years ago. I don't really remember that much, but I just remember there's an article that I read saying that The Waves is the most Wagnerian of all Virginia Woolf's novels. I think it's because of the use of leitmotif, so that every character is associated with a specific theme. But also other scholars argue that actually The Waves was written in the middle period of Virginia Woolf's creativity. And during that time, she already started to show a certain extent of distaste for Wagner's music. And she is instead leaning towards the absolute music, the sort of transcendental music of late Beethoven or late Bach, which is not combining the medium of many arts, but focuses on the purely musical art itself. So the debate as to how Wagnerian The Waves is, I think, is still quite disputable. Yeah, so that's my answer to this question.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, because I know that Jane Marcus has written about it and Julia Briggs written about it, but I suppose this was a while ago, so I'm sure that debate is moving on. So yeah, thank you for that answer.
I had a question for you as well, Alexandra. I just wanted to get a clarification, just for my own sake. I was wondering if you could just give us a definition for the decadent, and whether you were saying, I just wanted to understand, because I found your paper fascinating, and I just wanted to be clear on whether you're saying Rachel's radical selfhood is decadent, and so therefore out of step with the ordinary, like with the patriarchal order in place, or maybe if you could speak to that for a moment, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, your question is so helpful for me, as this is the concluding chapter of my thesis and it's still in progress. So I mean, clarifying the term decadence, I think it will really help me write better in my final chapter. So my take of decadence, I'm trying to define decadence as the opposition to the sort of mundane and ordinary and everyday circumstances of life in the post-Victorian England. And this is based on what J.L. Austin, the American philosopher, says in How to Do Things with Words. It's a monograph published in the 1960s based on his William James lecture in the Humboldt-Universität. And so in this monograph, he views all artistic performance as somehow kind of parasitic upon the ordinary circumstances of the everyday life. And also his speech act theory imposes kind of hierarchical binary that denounces art and all theater and all even poetry and all sorts of performances as non-serious. And what I'm taking out from J.L. Austin's theory is that I use that binary lens to view the late 19th century and early 20th century cultural life in Europe society. So there is a binary, which is the bourgeois and aesthete binary, and that informs my reading of the decadence here, because the decadence suggests a radical drift from the healthy and the Philistine and the normally functioning order of the middle class society. And decadence is always associated with the ineffable and the beautiful and also the transcendental, and finally links to death. So that's my take of decadence here.
So it's the artistic that's linked to the death.
Yeah.
As in, right, in order to preserve the bourgeois order.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sorry, in order to, yeah, rebirth the bourgeois order.
Okay, yeah, no, that's fantastic. That's really helpful. Thank you.
So there are lots of comments in the chat.
Yes.
Rhonda has one for Lee about, well, there are several for Lee that she's already started to respond to, but I think Rhonda has one more about Bloomsbury and its representations of suicide, and perhaps, I don't know, Rhonda, if you want to elaborate, go ahead. But
hello, I just wanted to ask if, I don't really know much about suicide apart from what Woolf wrote, but I was just wondering what Bloomsbury and her friends, no doubt they would have discussed these issues, what the wider viewpoint was about suicide within the group. Obviously, these discussions would have been so important to all of them, and if they had their own ideas on what those representations were, and also thinking about Dora Carrington and her death. I think she committed suicide in the 30s, 1932. So I was wondering, did that change Woolf's view on suicide? That was quite a big gap from when Mrs. Dalloway was written. I know these are sort of outside your sphere, but I was just really curious.
I was actually in the midst of typing back to you, so I'm happy to speak out loud.
Thank you.
I don't look too much at the Bloomsbury group so much, but I do think they would have had this non-judgmental perspective towards suicide. And I think with regards to Dora Carrington's suicide, I've always felt from reading the letters and the diaries that Woolf felt guilty that she didn't do enough to connect with Dora in that moment of her grief. But I don't think she condemned her suicide or thought ill of her or thought of it as a tragedy. I think she just felt that she didn't do enough in that to connect with Dora before she had committed it. And remember, she had seen Dora, just very shortly before she had committed suicide. So it was also at a moment where Woolf was also losing a lot of other friends in her life too, right? Shachi had died. I'm not sure, had Fry had died at this point? I believe he had. But it was a moment where Woolf was thinking a lot about, death and suicide. But I do think she had this, as someone who had attempted her life when she was young, I think going forward in her adult life, she understood what would make a person do this. And I think she always had this sort of non-judgmental view that I'm not going to judge you for choosing this, because this is a choice that you make, and it's a choice that I have made in the past. These are just my thoughts.
Angela had some really great questions for everybody in the chat. Shall we go back to the idea of the engagement scene with Alexandra, perhaps?
Yeah, I was curious, Alexandra, because you connected, because you talked about death in the way that you did as this kind of cutting away of decadence. I just wondered what you made of the engagement scene, because it's a very strange scene in The Voyage Out where the characters seem to go a little mad, and you talked about madness in your paper as well. And they seem to be submerged underwater, and at the end of it, you're not really sure if she's engaged or not, but she's not sure, and then you are sure. And so I wondered how, if you have had a chance to read it in the way that you've read the end.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. And I haven't really tried to analyze the engagement scene through the same Wagnerian lens. But I think the absolute crux is just that so the rhythm of water throughout this novel is that it is attuned to Rachel's weird music and her idiosyncratic pianism. And so the rhythm of water, her musicality, and her pianism, this all departs from the patriarchal life and the symbolic order of words. Yeah, but I will pay more attention to the engagement thing afterwards.
Oh no, I just thought it might have some interesting resonances there. But you mentioned the underwater, which of course brings me to Marlene. And Marlene, I was just wondering, I loved in your paper how you connected the impersonality of nature and how it's indifferent to us, to a kind of to Woolf's aesthetic to seek the impersonal in her writing. And I know you could only give us a couple of examples in your paper, but I was wondering if you'd like to expand on that, given that it's a fragment of a whole book.
Thank you, Angie. Yes, impersonality is indeed a key term in my book. And I try to contextualize it by looking at a more general modernist affinity for impersonality. I mean, we famously have that with T.S. Eliot. But what I find so special about Woolf is that that her waterscapes, this is my argument, actually almost seem to figure as a material container of other literary voices. And The Voyage Out, for instance, is a case in point, because through the water imagery in the novel, we get Milton, we get Chaucer, actually. So there are all these hidden allusions to a literary past, something that Woolf at one point refers to as the sunken meanings of the text. So the idea that literary texts are hugely ambiguous, and part of the ambiguity is a richness of voices that becomes manifest in these waterscapes. This is how I try to connect an impersonal writing that acknowledges its indebtedness to the literary past with an awareness, with Woolf's awareness of the indifference of nature that also put things into perspective. So a kind of, I mean, this word, we already, I think we already encountered this word during the conference, but really the kind of humility, this awareness that there is always something bigger, one is always only part of a whole, is, I think, at the heart of Virginia Woolf's writing, really. And the in-person writing and the awareness of the indifference of nature are two ways of showing this, I think.
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer. So she's putting herself within the literary tradition, but also within the natural.
Yeah. And I think these are really the two main sources of her writing. So and the biggest inspirations, really.
Thank you so much. We're at 3:30 now, so I think this is time for the very end of the meeting. Thank you very much to everybody for taking part. It's been absolutely fantastic to hear all of your papers and to listen to this discussion. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Oh, I see Jeanette's put a record of the chat. So you can download that now. I'll just let you do that for a moment and then we'll finish the meeting. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to all the panelists.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure. What a treat.